it's just a lot of little stuff people never knew about when you hear these hip-hop stories, and they keep telling you the story of Biggie and Tupac and that you never hear names like Jake being included.
I heard a bunch of commotion and people running and screaming and whatnot.
I got a call about 2 in the morning saying that he got shot. And, I need to get out there.
Wolf, rest in peace. You know, he let off a shot and let off a couple shots, and Suge Man got killed right there in Atlanta. That was the beginning of that whole.
Let's take it back to one of the most infamous beefs in hip-hop history, the East Coast versus West Coast feud. Some say it's the very rivalry that led to the tragic deaths of Tupac Shakur and Biggie Smalls. But the real question is, how did this whole firestorm even begin? For years, the whispers around the streets tied it all back to one pivotal moment, and at the center of it was a man named Big Jake.
That death is arguably the most important death in hip-hop. Jake was the first time rap turned into street.
Big Jake, a high-ranking member of the OG Piru gang, was a known affiliate of Death Row Records. Wasn't just a familiar face in Suge Knight's circle. He was practically family, doubling as his close friend and bodyguard. In 1995, a birthday party thrown by Jermaine Dupri brought two volatile camps together, Death Row and Bad Boy Records, complete with their leaders, Suge and Diddy, in the mix.
Thing about that whole Bad Boy Death Row I invited both of these niggas to my birthday party. Then that yeah. And I don't know what happened.
What could possibly go wrong, right? Well, according to the rumors, the tension reached its boiling point, and by the end of the night, Jake was gunned down, allegedly by Puff's right-hand man, Anthony Wolf Jones. That moment, many believe, lit the spark for the East Coast versus West Coast war that shook the entire industry.
Wolf, rest in peace. You know, he let off a shot and let off a couple of shots, and Suge Man got killed right there in Atlanta. That was the beginning of that whole.
But here's where it gets murky. For years, Wolf's name was the one whispered behind closed doors as Jake's. In fact, Jermaine Dupri, in recent interviews, has come out to discuss what had gone down that night. While he believed that Wolf had off Jake, Gene Deal, Puffy's former bodyguard, decided to break his silence by offering a new insight. Deal claims Jones might have been wrongly accused and suggests the real shooter was a man named Jason, who acted in defense of his girlfriend after an argument with Suge and Jake turned nasty.
That Wolf never Jake. That was all propaganda that they was trying to start up. You know, to say there's the bad boy East Coast, West Coast.
It's no secret that the East Coast-West Coast feud intensified, leaving a permanent scar on hip-hop, but just how much of that can be traced back to Big Jake's death? Let's break it all down. The East Coast-West Coast hip-hop rivalry wasn't just your everyday beef over music or styles. It was this boiling pot of egos, territorial pride, and rising fame that exploded in the mid-1990s, turning the United States into a battleground for beats and bars. At the heart of it all were two titans. On one side, you had the East Coast heavyweight, the notorious Big, under the wing of Puff Daddy and Bad Boy Records, repping New York's relentless energy. And on the other side, there was the poetic storm that was Tupac Shakur, signed to Suge Knight's Death Row Records, carrying the sun-soaked, gritty West Coast swagger of Los Angeles. However, things took a nasty turn in September 1995, at what should have been just another industry party in Atlanta. Picture this, a glitzy late-night birthday bash at the Platinum House, full of music moguls, entourages, and that thick tension that seems to follow Suge Knight and Puffy Combs everywhere. And sure enough, that tension boiled over outside the club when chaos erupted.
Suge and Puff got into a screaming match, and it looked like it was getting serious.
Fists flew, guns were drawn, and when the smoke cleared, Jake Robles, a Death Row affiliate and one of Suge's close friends, was on the ground, fatally wounded. Witnesses didn't hesitate to point fingers. Word on the street was that one of Puffy's bodyguards pulled the trigger.
I knew Wolf to be Puff's right-hand man, that if anything jump off, he's gonna be there and he's gonna defend it.
And Suge? Oh, he wasn't about to let that slide. But this wasn't just about Robles' death. It was a domino that sent waves through an already volatile situation. Days later, things got downright sinister when Mark Anthony Bell, a New York record promoter with ties to Puffy, found himself pulled into the storm. Bell gets this cryptic message from someone dangling a record deal in exchange for information. Addresses, specifically those of Puffy and his mother. Bell, smart enough to see the danger lurking in the shadows, refuses to cooperate.
Previous visit to LA just a few weeks after Jake Robles died, Bell had been approached in the lobby of that same Death Row Records building. As he was leaving through the lobby, a Death Row employee handed Bell a typewritten note asking him to, quote, reveal any information on Combs, Combs' family, or associates. The note instructed him to reply on the note and to then simply drop it on the floor. And Bell apparently refused to do this.
But Death Row wasn't done with him, not by a long shot. Fast forward a few months, and Bell is at Death Row's infamous Christmas party, held at this swanky spot in Hollywood, Chateau LeBlanc. It's supposed to be festive, but when Suge Knight arrives, things take a dark turn. Suge confronts Bell directly, dropping a chilling line. Why didn't you cooperate when you had the chance?
So about a month and a half later, Bell and his friend arrive at the Christmas party around 10:30 at night, and his friend goes to work photographing the party. At around 2 a.m., Suge Knight arrives with an entourage. And while Suge is making the rounds, he encounters Bell and asks him, why didn't you cooperate?
Before Bell can explain himself, he's ushered into the VIP room surrounded by a posse that included none other than Dr. Dre and Tupac.
Bell follows Suge upstairs to the VIP room where he's going to get a special form of VIP service. So Suge allegedly has his brother-in-law, Norris Anderson, clear everyone out of the VIP room and then stand outside the door. And left in the room with Bell is allegedly Suge Knight, Tupac Shakur, Dr. Dre, Gold Teeth, whose name Bell doesn't catch, so he's just referred to in this report as Gold Teeth, and 2 other men.
What followed was nothing short of a nightmare.
Gold Teeth offers his own input, which is hitting Bell on the side of the face, and he says, this is for the person who died, most likely a reference to Jake Robles, and we're going.
Suge interrogated Bell relentlessly, and when Bell didn't give him the answers he wanted, the situation turned violent. One of Suge's men, described as a terrifying presence, began beating Bell, all while shouting, "This is for Jake." And just when you think things couldn't get worse, Suge left the room, returning with a champagne flute. Not for a toast, but filled with urine. He demanded Bell drink it. When Bell refused, the beatings continued. Desperate, Bell tried to fake compliance only to seize an opportunity to escape. He bolted for the balcony, thinking maybe, just maybe, he could leap to safety. But they caught him, dragged him back, and the beating resumed, precise and brutal, as Suge ordered, body blows only. Eventually, Bell played dead, the violence subsided, and he was left bruised, battered, and stripped of his valuables.
Bell nearly passes out and decides to just go with it, and he plays dead. And while he's on the floor, someone takes his watch off his wrist, and he also loses his gold chain and his wallet. And his attackers also considered taking his diamond earring.
This wasn't just a rivalry anymore, it was war. And that night in Hollywood was proof that the battle between East and West wasn't just confined to the airwaves or diss tracks. It was raw, dangerous, and bleeding into real life in ways that would leave scars on hip-hop forever. Let's take a step back and really unpack how this whole East Coast-West Coast rivalry even got started, because honestly, the roots of this feud are tangled up in history, pride, and some very raw emotions that turned a cultural movement into a battleground. So picture this. It's the 1970s and hip-hop is being born in the Bronx, New York City. The East Coast, especially NYC, is the epicenter of this incredible new art form. Hip-hop music, breakdancing, graffiti, DJing, the whole culture. Naturally, East Coast rappers grew up with this sense that they were the standard, the pioneers, and the gatekeepers of what hip-hop was supposed to be. Now here's the catch. While the East Coast was busy riding that wave of cultural dominance, the West Coast was quietly coming into its own. By the late 1980s, the West Coast wasn't just dabbling in hip-hop. They were flipping the script, led by groups like NWA from Compton. They had their own sound, raw and unapologetic, telling stories of life in the streets, and people were listening. But this is where things got a little dicey, because as the West Coast started making noise, there was this undercurrent of tension. East Coast rappers were often seen as looking down on their West Coast peers, kind of like, yeah, cool, but this is our house. Meanwhile, on the West, there was this growing frustration, a feeling of being dismissed, underestimated, and treated like the underdog, despite the rising success. And then came the sparks. In 1991, Tim Dog, a Bronx rapper, decided he had something to say about the West Coast. He dropped Penicillin on Wax, which wasn't just an album. It was a slap in the face to the West, packed with skits mocking West Coast artists and a diss track called F Compton aimed squarely at NWA, especially Dr. Dre. It was bold, it was provocative, and it set the tone for what was to come. Dr. Dre, never one to let something like that slide, fired back in 1992 with his debut solo album, The Chronic. While Tim Dog didn't exactly stick around to play a major role in the later stages of the feud, his track was like the opening bell in a heavyweight fight, letting everyone know that this East versus West thing wasn't going to stay friendly for long. Around the same time, the chess pieces were falling into place. On the West Coast, Suge Knight was building an empire. In 1991, he co-founded Death Row Records with Dr. Dre, The Doc, and Dick Griffey. Suge wasn't just some random executive. He was Compton through and through, with deep ties to the Bloods, and he carried that chip on his shoulder about the West Coast being disrespected. Death Row quickly became a powerhouse, and by 1993, they were unstoppable. Meanwhile, on the East Coast, Sean Puff Daddy Combs was making waves of his own, founding Bad Boy Records in New York. Puff was the ultimate hustler, and by 1994, Bad Boy had two breakout stars, the charismatic Brooklyn rapper The Notorious Big and Craig Mack. With their instant success, Bad Boy became the crown jewel of the East Coast scene. And then there was Tupac. By 1994, Pac was this larger-than-life figure, a New York-born, California-adopted rapper who had dropped 2 successful albums and starred in major films. But even as his career soared, his life was spiraling. He was caught in legal trouble, broke, and standing trial for serious charges in New York. It was a volatile time for him, and his struggles were like kindling, waiting for a spark. That spark came in 1995 at the infamous Source Awards. Suge Knight, never one to mince words, decided to stir the pot in front of the whole industry. Taking a jab at Puff Daddy, he stood on stage and declared, "Any artist out there that want to be an artist and want to stay a star, and don't want to have to worry about the executive producer trying to be all in the videos, all on the records, dancing, come to Death Row."
Any artist out there want to be an artist and want to stay a star, don't want to have to worry about the executive producer trying to be all in the video, all on the record, dancing, come to Death Row.
It was a thinly veiled shot at Puff's hands-on, flashy style, and the New York crowd wasn't having it. They booed loudly, but Suge didn't flinch, and neither did his crew. Later that night, when Dr. Dre was named Producer of the Year and the boos came again, Snoop Dogg grabbed the mic and let the audience feel the West Coast heat. The East Coast ain't got no love for Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg and Death Row. Y'all don't love us? Y'all don't love us? Well, let it be known then. We don't give an F. We know y'all East Coast. We know where the F we at. It was more than a moment. It was a declaration. The tension was out in the open now, loud and undeniable. The East and West weren't just competing anymore, they were clashing, and the whole hip-hop world was about to feel the aftershocks. As the tension escalated, Puff Daddy tried to be the voice of reason, or at least attempted to throw water on a fire that had already become an inferno. When he took the stage at the Source Awards, he made a plea for unity, saying, "All this East and West, that needs to stop. So give it up for everybody from the East and the West that won tonight. One love." It was a noble sentiment, sure, but the energy in the room and on the streets was way past the point where a little speech could calm things down. Not long after, Jake Robles, a close associate of Suge Knight, lost his life, adding more fuel to the fire and significantly marked the start of bloodshed between these rivals. Suge, never one to let anything slide, saw this as a moment to double down. He secured Tupac's release from prison in October 1995, putting up a whopping $1.4 million bond to spring him out of Clinton Correctional Facility. Suge didn't just send a check. He flew across the country and rolled up to the prison gates in a limousine to pick Tupac up himself.
Then we had to fly a smaller plane from New York to the area we had to go to visit him out of prison. So we had to take a jet because the big plane wouldn't be too big. Hour and some limousine ride from the jet.
That gesture wasn't just about freedom. It was about loyalty, power, and setting the stage for the next chapter in their alliance. Tupac wasted no time jumping into the fray. Fresh out of prison, he aligned with Suge and turned Death Row's feud with Bad Boy into an all-out verbal assault. His music became a weapon, with tracks like Hit 'Em Up, Bomb First, My Second Reply, and Against All Odds, calling out Biggie, Puffy, and just about anyone affiliated with them. Tupac's Hit 'Em Up wasn't just a diss track. It was a declaration of war, laced with venom and personal attacks. He called Biggie out by name, mocked his marriage to Faith Evans, and tore into Bad Boy with unrelenting fury. Biggie never openly responded to Tupac in his music, but speculation lingered. Junior MMAFIA's Lil Cease hinted that Long Kiss Goodnight was a subtle jab at Tupac, though Puff Daddy refuted it. insisting Biggie wouldn't have used veiled lyrics. If he had something to say, he'd say it outright. Meanwhile, the media ran wild with the feud, dubbing it a coastal rap war and amplifying the tension. Fans were swept up in the drama, choosing sides as the rivalry grew beyond the music and into a cultural battleground. Amid the chaos, there were fleeting moments of unity. In 1996, Nas and Dr. Dre collaborated on Nas's Coming for Nas's album It Was Written, dismissing the feud as senseless and advocating for collaboration to secure success. But such gestures were rare, as the divide between the coasts was deepening by the day. In December 1995, tensions flared when Thaw Dog Pound filmed their New York video in Brooklyn. After Biggie's shoutout on Hot 97, which Thaw Dog Pound initially took as support, shots were fired at their set, marking a grim turn. The group responded in their video with imagery of Snoop smashing New York buildings, a bold visual retort to the hostility. By 1996, East Coast artists struck back with LA Louisiana by Capone and Noriega, Mobb Deep, and Tragedy Khadafi, adding fuel to the already raging fire. Then, on September 7, 1996, tragedy struck. Tupac Shakur was gunned down in a Las Vegas drive just hours after a Mike Tyson fight. He died 6 days later, leaving the hip-hop world reeling.
Suspects or motive in the rapper and actor Tupac Shakur, who died last Friday the 13th after being gunned down in a drive-by following the Mike Tyson-Bruce Seldon boxing match September 7th.
Theories abounded, with some reports pointing to the Southside Crips seeking revenge for an earlier altercation. Other claims implicated Biggie, though no conclusive evidence ever emerged. 6 months after Tupac's tragic death, the hip-hop world was rocked again when the notorious Big was gunned down on March 9, 1997, in a drive-by shooting in Los Angeles.
It was crazy for me. I think that's the first time I couldn't hold back my tears.
It's the last thing I thought, that Big would be dead, but it was reality. It was real.
Just like Tupac's Emder, Biggie's case remains unsolved, though rumors swirled about Suge Knight's possible involvement, even as Knight was heading to prison for a parole violation just a week before the shooting. In the midst of the chaos, efforts were made to bring peace. On September 22, 1996, Louis Farrakhan held a peace summit at Mosque Mariam following Tupac's Emder, aiming to address the escalating violence. A few months later, in February 1997, Snoop Dogg and Puff Daddy made a public call for unity on The Steve Harvey Show, with Snoop urging, "Kids around the world are watching. By calling for a truce, we're giving them something to live for." Unfortunately, their plea for peace wasn't enough to stop the violence, as Biggie was offed less than a month later. On April 3, 1997, another attempt at reconciliation took place when key figures in hip-hop, including Snoop Dogg, Thaw Dog Pound, Ice Cube, and Fat Joe, gathered at Farrakhan's Ministry House in Chicago to discuss ending the East Coast-West Coast feud. Despite these efforts, the damage was already done, and the rivalry left a deep scar on the culture. In the aftermath, some artists ridiculed the feud, like Big Pun, who dismissed the East or West crap in his track You Ain't a Killer. Others, like The Game, paid tribute to both Tupac and Biggie, shouting out RIP to them in his song Put You on the Game. Over time, collaborations like Eminem and Snoop Dogg's From the D to the LBC promoted unity, blending influences from Detroit and Long Beach, and showing that the spirit of collaboration could rise above the rivalry. Meanwhile, stories surrounding Big Jake's death continued to surface. Jermaine and Gene Deal, in separate interviews, shared conflicting accounts, with Jermaine suggesting that an altercation between Suge and Diddy escalated, leading to Jones, now deceased, firing shots at Big Jake. These varying narratives keep the mystery alive, highlighting just how deep the wounds of this feud remain. In the end, the story of Big Jake Robles' tragic death in 1995 remains tangled in conflicting accounts and unanswered questions. Gene Deal claimed that Suge Knight slapped Jermaine Dupri that night, calling JD a liar who was allegedly hiding upstairs during the shooting.
Jermaine Dupri is a liar, and the truth ain't in him. He ain't see a damn thing. That night at that party, he was upstairs with Dallas Austin, cause Suge had slapped the him too.
Deal also suggested Big Jake was actually offed by a man named Jason after a heated exchange involving Jason's girlfriend, Nicole.
Jake was talking to Jason's girl. Jason's girl, Nicole, she from the West Coast, was slicking them bad. I got pictures with her and her crew.
According to Deal, rumors blaming Wolf for the Emder were false, and Jermaine Dupri couldn't have witnessed anything since he wasn't even present when it all went down. Adding to the chaos, a 2003 lawsuit by Kirk Burroughs alleged that Diddy approved Jake's Emder, with a now-deceased sheriff supposedly identifying Wolf as the shooter. Despite all the accusations and finger-pointing, no charges were ever brought against anyone for Jake's Emder. And just like that, the mystery persists, a haunting chapter in the East Coast-West Coast saga that may never truly be resolved.